Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most audacious, structurally bizarre, and fiercely debated literary experiments ever written. We are unpacking a fictional manuscript known as the Nagasaki Notebooks of Shōnagon. Critics are completely torn on this one. They either hail it as this profound, world-altering masterpiece of witness, or they absolutely savage it as an unhinged act of literary disaster porn. So let's get into it, because we are exploring exactly what happens when you take history's most refined, hyper-aesthetic listmaker and just drop her right into the middle of the apocalypse.
Okay, so let's set up this wild premise. The historical Sei Shōnagon was a 10th century Japanese court lady, famously known for writing the Pillow Book. Basically, a collection of super gossipy, ultra-refined lists about, the way a face looks by lantern light or the delicate flight of startled sparrows. Well, the Nagasaki Notebooks deliberately displaces this exact same 10th century narrator into the nuclear fallout of August 9, 1945. It asks this crazy question: what happens if this woman, who literally spent her life ranking kimono colors and poetry, applies that exact same meticulous, elegant cataloging to an atomic flash and mass death? It's this surreal, almost unthinkable collision of classical aesthetics and nuclear annihilation.
Section 1. An audacious literary premise. To really grasp why this bizarre narrative framing actually works, and to be fair, why it makes some critics so incredibly angry, we have to look at the philosophy driving our time-traveling narrator.
It all hinges on the foundational concept of mono no aware. You're probably familiar with it. It roughly translates to the pathos of things, or that aching beauty of impermanence. Historically, Sei Shōnagon was always writing about things that burn brightly for a fleeting moment and then just vanish, like morning glories or fading cherry blossoms. But here, the text takes that delicate, refined concept and applies it to the ultimate horrifying conclusion: a nuclear bomb. It takes impermanence and turns it into a terrifying, instantaneous policy. The flash lasted less than a second and ended absolutely everything.
And to process all of this, she uses her original 10th century observational lists. The categories are completely identical to her ancient court diaries. But instead of using things that cannot be compared to anything else to complain about awkward men arriving late, she uses it to catalog the atomic flash itself. She uses elegant things to describe apocalyptic sunsets that are only made beautiful by the ash of a dead city. It's wild. It is either the most grotesque misuse of a literary form imaginable, or literally the most precise way to document the end of the world.
Moving to Section 2, the emotional center. Because amidst all this absurdity and highly stylized framing, the book actually earns its ambitious premise through these moments of breathtaking, grounded humanity.
Take this perfect image, for example. In the Elegant Things section, our narrator observes an old man sitting in the blackened ruins, meticulously performing a completely silent tea ceremony with a cracked but intact bowl. It brilliantly illustrates the text's core thesis. It's telling us that the maintenance of form and culture during a catastrophe is a profound act of resistance. By simply continuing the rituals, the text argues that culture itself cannot be totally bombed out of existence, not as long as someone remembers how to perform it.
But the true emotional zenith of the entire manuscript is actually devastatingly simple. It's just a mother hoarsely calling out for her child in the smoking ruins, a voice echoing, "Yuki-chan, Yuki-chan." The narrator just watches this agonizing search expand into the silence, noting only that the child's name, Yuki, means snow, a beauty that melts when touched. And what makes this hit so hard is what the narrator doesn't do. She doesn't over-explain, she doesn't philosophize the trauma into some abstract concept. She just watches the mother search, letting the heartbreak speak entirely for itself. For a lot of readers, this is the exact moment the book's overarching premise is totally justified. And watch how this builds into the structural choices of the book. Remember, this is a manuscript utterly obsessed with categorization, but then we hit the category, things I wish I had never seen. And beneath it, nothing. Just the sentence, I will not list them. This completely empty category becomes the loudest ethical statement in the entire text. The observer decides that some horror should just be allowed to die rather than be preserved. She flat out refuses to transmit the horror to the reader.
The text even has the self-awareness to turn on itself. At one point, the narrator watches a woman dying alone of radiation sickness, but maintains her distance, openly admitting this might just be cowardice, choosing documentation over actual human care. Under Hateful Things, she impartially presents the political justifications for the bomb right alongside her own impulse to make lists. She's actively questioning if her relentless categorization is just an emotional retreat. Is she hiding behind formalism simply because formalism is all she knows?
Which brings us to Section 3, the unfiltered roast. Because right when you start thinking this is some pure, unassailable masterpiece of historical fiction, the critics step in, and wow, they unleash a brutal, zero-mercy roast of the manuscript's glaring flaws.
Critics are quick to point out the sheer pretentiousness of what is essentially a 10th century influencer filtering a nuclear holocaust through a hyper-aesthetic lens. They highlight these really jarring moments, like the narrator pausing by a smoking crater to write a wabi-sabi essay about a dew-covered spiderweb, which critics mockingly dubbed arachnid real estate. They point out how absurd it is that a court lady who used to complain about the wrong shade of green suddenly has a PhD in theoretical physics, casually explaining radiation half-life. They even call her out for stealing a child's wooden top from the rubble just because it fits her aesthetic criteria for things that make the heart ache.
The critique savages the book, calling it high-end cosplay in a war zone. One critic had this amazing line, saying it's giving, "I just discovered non-dualism on Reddit, and now I'm making it everyone else's problem." Their argument is that dressing up a horrific historical event in exquisite purple prose about melted people and moral philosophy doesn't honor the tragedy at all. It just turns it into exquisite disaster porn.
So, Section 4, the paradox of witnessing. How on earth do we reconcile these two wildly different views? Is it an empathetic masterpiece, or is it an incredibly self-indulgent, offensive thought experiment?
Well, the answer this explainer finds in the source material is that the book purposefully enacts its own unresolvable problem. When the narrator questions why she is making lists while the city literally burns down around her, the text provides a simple, almost brutal answer. The spider builds the web because that is what spiders do. The observer makes the list. Humans will continue to categorize, notice, and name things because that is the unending work of consciousness, even when consciousness feels entirely inadequate for the end of the world.
When you weigh these two prevailing views, you really see the true duality of the text. It uses the aesthetic distance of a court lady to approach a horror that simply cannot be looked at directly. It's kind of like using your peripheral vision to see a star that's too dim, or in this case, a flash that is way too bright to look at head-on. Yes, it is heavily stylized, and yes, it flirts dangerously with being disaster porn. But it's also this brilliant testimony to the human impulse to organize chaos.
Ultimately, we want to leave you with this to ponder, because it's really the core of why this source material matters. Does the persistent, elegant observation of total annihilation actually honor the tragedy by ensuring it's recorded? Or does filtering mass death through a lens of beauty trivialize the very real suffering of those who were actually there? It's an unresolvable tension, for sure, but it makes the Nagasaki notebooks an absolutely fascinating exploration of how we document the unimaginable. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the stories around us are framed.